It was supposed to be just another typical afternoon in the suburban neighborhood. The sky hung low, heavy with the promise of a sudden rainstorm. The kind of afternoon where time moves slowly, and the world outside feels far away, cocooned by the walls of a house that knows only routine. Inside, a young woman stood in the kitchen, her hands rhythmically chopping vegetables as she hummed softly to herself, lost in thought. She had done this countless times before, serving as a caretaker, a nanny, to the children of families who relied on her for their support. But today was different. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved toward the door, expecting the usual greeting, a small, smiling face and a heartfelt hello from the children. What she didn't expect was the cold, piercing stare that met her when she opened the door. Standing before her was the woman of the house, her posture stiff, her eyes filled with a mix of judgment and disdain. Without a word, the woman stepped inside, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor, as if to announce her arrival. The nanny, who had grown accustomed to this household's rhythms, immediately sensed the tension in the air. The mother had never been particularly warm, but today, something was different. There was a hardness to her demeanor that sent a chill down the nanny's spine. "Is everything okay?" the nanny asked, her voice filled with the natural curiosity that came from years of working in people's homes. But the question hung in the air, unanswered, as the woman scanned the room with a critical eye. It was as though she was evaluating not just the state of the house, but of everything in it, every detail, every corner, every interaction. "Why haven't you finished the laundry?" the woman snapped suddenly, her voice sharp and demanding. The nanny blinked, taken aback by the accusation. She had done the laundry earlier that morning, and yet, there it was, an obvious insult. She stammered, trying to explain that there must have been some confusion, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat, as though the woman wasn't interested in hearing her side of things. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating almost, as the woman's gaze never left her. The nanny could feel the weight of the silence between them, thick with unspoken words and judgment. And before she could gather her thoughts, the woman launched into a tirade, belittling her for the smallest of mistakes, things that were insignificant in the grand scheme of the household. But the cutting tone, the sharp words, they were impossible to ignore. It wasn't long before the nanny realized that the woman's frustration had nothing to do with the housework. It wasn't the laundry, the dishes, or even the children's toys left scattered on the floor. It was something deeper, something personal. Something that had festered for far too long. But what was it? What had triggered this sudden, unprovoked eruption? As the woman continued to berate her, the nanny's mind raced, trying to understand the cause of the hostility. She had always been professional, always done her job without complaint. So why today? Why now? The tension between them reached its breaking point when the woman said something that struck the nanny like a slap to the face. "You're not even good at your job," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. The words stung, cutting deeper than any physical blow could. The nanny stood there, paralyzed, unable to respond. She felt humiliated, small, as if all the work she had put into caring for this family had been reduced to nothing. But just as the woman finished speaking, something unexpected happened. The nanny looked up, her eyes locking with the woman's, and for a brief moment, the cold mask that had been plastered across her face faltered. There was a flicker of regret, of recognition, like a fleeting moment of clarity breaking through the cloud of anger and frustration. The woman's words died in her throat as the realization hit her. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the world had paused for a moment. And just as quickly as the anger had appeared, it vanished, replaced by something entirely different. What happened in that moment? What changed? But the story doesn't end there. The events that followed would leave the nanny questioning everything she thought she knew about the woman she worked for and about herself. And in the blink of an eye, the power dynamic between them would shift, sending both women down a path that neither could have predicted. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where the truth is revealed, and the consequences of that fleeting moment of regret will echo far beyond the walls of the house. The moment of silence that followed the woman's harsh words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just the sting of the insult that left the nanny speechless. It was the sudden shift, the fleeting vulnerability that flashed across the woman's face, as if she had momentarily broken free from her own rage. In that instant, the nanny saw something that made her question everything she knew about her employer, something far deeper than just a misunderstanding or a bad mood. But the flicker of regret vanished as quickly as it had come, and the woman's steely expression returned, colder and more distant than before. It was a strange feeling, standing there, not knowing whether to stay or leave. The nanny had always been the professional one, the calm one who could handle any situation with grace. She'd spent years working for families, getting to know them, understanding their needs, and navigating the complexities of their lives. But today was different. Today, she wasn't sure what was going on beneath the surface. The woman's behavior was so erratic, so inconsistent, that it left her disoriented, unsure of how to respond. What had caused this? Why had the woman lashed out so suddenly? The tension between them lingered like an unspoken challenge. The nanny knew she had to say something, but the words didn't come. She felt a lump form in her throat, as if her body was rebelling against the situation. The woman's gaze remained cold and unforgiving, yet there was an underlying shift, a crack in her perfect facade that hinted at something more. But the nanny couldn't tell what it was. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. She wondered if the woman would say something else, if she would somehow explain herself, but instead, the woman turned away and started walking toward the living room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as if nothing had happened. The nanny's heart raced, still reeling from the interaction, but she followed, almost instinctively. She couldn't leave it like this, not without some sort of resolution, even if she didn't know what that would look like. When they reached the living room, the woman paused and turned to face the nanny. Her eyes softened just a little, but the coldness never completely disappeared. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words felt forced, robotic, as if they were being dragged out against her will. The nanny didn't know how to respond. She had heard apologies before, empty, quick apologies that were more about making the other person go away than about genuine remorse. And while the woman's words sounded like an apology, her body language told a different story. It felt like something was missing, some key element of sincerity that could have made the words meaningful. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," the woman continued, her voice softer now, though still lacking the warmth of a true apology. "I just sometimes things get to me, you know? Things outside of this house. It's hard to explain." The nanny nodded, still unsure of what was going on. She had heard similar things from people before, excuses for bad behavior that were designed to shift the blame away from the person causing the pain. But this didn't feel like that. There was a rawness in the woman's voice, a vulnerability that the nanny couldn't ignore. But she didn't trust it. "Not yet." "I understand," the nanny replied, her voice quiet. She didn't want to engage in this moment any longer. There were too many unanswered questions, too much confusion swirling around them. But she also didn't want to make the situation worse by rejecting the woman's attempt at reconciliation. The truth was, she wasn't sure how to move forward. And then, just as quickly as the moment of regret had come, it vanished again. The woman straightened up, as if suddenly reminded of the control she had lost, and her eyes hardened once more. "Good. Let's keep it that way," she said, her tone now brisk, businesslike, as though the incident had never happened. The nanny swallowed, her chest tight. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand, one where the rules changed on a whim, and where every action seemed to carry weight, even when nothing was said. She glanced at the clock on the wall, aware that the children would be home soon. The day would continue, like it always did, and this awkward encounter would soon fade into the background, buried beneath the hum of daily life. But the nanny couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The woman's behavior had left a mark on her, and she couldn't let it go so easily. There was more to this situation than she could see, more than she had been told. The apology, the anger, the sudden change, it was all a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. And that unease gnawed at her, pulling her attention away from the present moment and toward the mystery that seemed to be brewing just beneath the surface. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy. The woman's interactions with the nanny were cordial, but distant. It was as though the tension from that afternoon had settled into a quiet, uncomfortable routine. The house felt colder somehow, and the nanny couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, her every move scrutinized under a hidden microscope. But what troubled her more was the sense that she was missing something, a crucial piece of information that could explain the strange behavior of her employer. The children, too, seemed distant, as though they were caught in the crossfire of something bigger than themselves. They played their usual games, but there was a nervous energy about them that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but the nanny noticed it. They'd glance nervously at the door whenever the woman would enter a room, or shift uncomfortably whenever she raised her voice, even in the most benign of situations. The nanny had always thought of herself as a protector of sorts, a shield for the children against the stress and tension that could seep into the home. But now, she was starting to wonder whether she was the one who needed protection. One afternoon, as the children napped and the house seemed unusually quiet, the nanny found herself in the kitchen again, trying to focus on her work. But she couldn't stop thinking about the woman, the way she had acted, the way she had suddenly softened and then hardened again. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right in her gut. That's when she saw the small piece of paper, tucked just out of view under a pile of mail on the counter. It was easy to miss, especially when the focus was elsewhere. But something about it caught her eye, and she moved toward it without thinking. As she picked it up, she realized it was a letter in envelope, slightly crumpled, with no return address. She opened it carefully, her heart racing as she unfolded the paper inside. The words were hastily scrawled, almost unreadable in places, but they were clear enough to make her blood run cold. Get out now. She knows what you've seen. Don't trust anyone. The message sent a shiver down her spine. She looked around, as if expecting someone to be watching her. The room felt oppressive, the air thick with tension. She stared at the letter for a long moment, her mind spinning. Who had written it? Who was warning her? And more importantly, what did they mean by "she knows what you've seen"? Suddenly, everything felt like it was unraveling. The pieces of the puzzle, the strange behavior, the sudden anger, the fleeting moments of regret were starting to make sense, but they only raised more questions. The nanny carefully folded the letter back up and tucked it into her pocket. She needed answers. She needed to know who was behind this and why. But she also knew that finding those answers would take her down a dangerous path, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. For now, she could only wait and watch, to see how far the truth would go. The letter, with its cryptic message, sat heavy in the nanny's pocket, as though it had transformed into a weight she couldn't escape. She had tried to ignore it, to go about her duties as usual, but the words kept echoing in her mind, replaying like a broken record. She knows what you've seen. What had she seen? What did that mean? Who could have written this, and why? Every glance at her employer now felt loaded with suspicion. The woman's icy demeanor, her sharp words, her sudden outbursts, was it all connected? Had the nanny unknowingly stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see? She couldn't be sure, but a growing sense of dread settled in her stomach. Days passed, but the feeling of unease never left. It was like walking through the house with a constant, invisible pressure bearing down on her. The woman continued her cold, demanding behavior, but there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when the walls around her cracked. The nanny couldn't help but notice how the woman would sometimes linger by the windows, staring out at the street for longer than seemed normal. There was a look in her eyes, a faraway, almost haunted expression, as though she was waiting for something. Or someone. But there were other things too. Small things that didn't add up. Like the way the woman had been so secretive lately. She was often on the phone in hushed tones, her words inaudible, but the tension in her posture was unmistakable. Every time the nanny would try to ask her a question, the woman would deflect with a quick change of subject, or sometimes, just a simple, dismissive wave of the hand. It felt like she was being shut out of a world she once thought she belonged to. One afternoon, as the nanny sat quietly in the living room, sorting through the children's toys, she overheard a conversation between the woman and someone on the phone. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but the words caught her ear. "You know what will happen if she finds out," the woman's voice was low, tense. "We can't let her get too close." "Not now." The nanny froze, her heart skipping a beat. What did that mean? Who was she talking about? And why was there such fear in her voice? She dared not move, didn't want to alert the woman that she might have overheard anything, so she sat still, breathless, hoping the conversation would offer more answers. But it didn't. The woman quickly hung up, and the room fell silent. The nanny remained frozen in place, unsure of what to do with the fragments of information she had just gathered. The fear in the woman's voice haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered a piece of something far larger than she could have imagined. The children, too, seemed to know something was wrong, though they didn't speak of it. There were times when they would glance nervously at the nanny, or huddle close to her when they thought the woman wasn't watching. They were children, after all, not yet fully aware of the complexities of adult relationships, but they could feel the tension. It wasn't something that could be hidden from them forever. That evening, as the woman once again retreated into her office for what seemed like another endless phone call, the nanny made a decision. She had to learn the truth, no matter the cost. She couldn't live in the dark any longer. There were too many unanswered questions, and she was tired of waiting for something to change. She had to dig deeper. The next morning, while the woman was away running errands, the nanny took a chance. She snuck into the woman's office, the place that had always been off limits. She'd cleaned it before, of course, but she'd never dared to look too closely at anything on the desk. Today, she didn't hold back. There were papers scattered on the desk, folders piled high with things she didn't recognize. But then something caught her eye. A small, leather-bound notebook sat at the corner, almost hidden under a stack of papers. The nanny hesitated, looking over her shoulder, making sure she wasn't being watched. With shaking hands, she opened it. The pages inside were filled with notes, jotted down reminders, to-do lists, but then, amidst the mundane, were references to something far more sinister. There were names listed, dates, and what appeared to be addresses. Some names she recognized, others she didn't. But what stood out to her were the phrases written in the margins, "Watching her, don't trust them, keep it quiet." The more she read, the more her heart raced. It was as though the woman was keeping track of something important, and the nanny was somehow involved in it. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her mind reeling with the implications. Had the woman been planning something all along? Something that had to do with her, or worse, the children. The thought made her stomach churn, but she couldn't stop herself from reading. She had to know what was happening. Just as she turned to the last page, her breath caught in her throat. The final entry was dated just a few days ago. It's almost time. She can't keep hiding. Who was she? The nanny's mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of the cryptic message. The woman had been hiding something, she was sure of it. But what? And why had it all been kept from her? Was she just an innocent bystander, caught in a game she didn't understand? Or was there more to her involvement than she realized? Suddenly, the sound of the front door opening jolted her from her thoughts. The woman was back. She quickly closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag, barely having time to compose herself before the woman appeared in the doorway. The woman's eyes narrowed as she took in the nanny's flustered appearance, her slightly ruffled clothes, the nervous look in her eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice cold, though there was a trace of something else in it, a sharpness, a note of suspicion. "Of course," the nanny replied quickly, trying to steady her breath. "I was just cleaning. Nothing out of the ordinary." The woman didn't seem convinced. She looked at the nanny for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not to question her further. Then, with a curt nod, she turned away, disappearing into the kitchen. The nanny stood frozen for a few moments, trying to calm the pounding of her heart. She had narrowly avoided discovery, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The woman had secrets, and those secrets were threatening to tear the house apart. But what could she do? She had no one to turn to, no one who could help her unravel the truth. She was alone in this. And every time she thought she was one step closer to understanding, the puzzle became more complicated, more dangerous. And in the shadows of that house, with its walls that held so many secrets, the nanny couldn't help but wonder just how far this mystery would go. How much more would she uncover before it all came crashing down? The days that followed felt like a carefully orchestrated game of cat and mouse. The woman, still distant and erratic, seemed to be watching the nanny with a hawk's eye, as if she knew something was off. But the nanny couldn't be sure. Every glance, every word, every movement felt loaded with hidden meaning. The tension between them was like a pressure cooker, steadily building with no clear way of releasing it. The children, too, seemed to be more on edge. There were times when they would stare at the nanny, their faces filled with an expression she couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or maybe confusion. Whatever it was, it made her stomach tighten. The once comfortable, almost familial atmosphere of the house had shifted, replaced with a cold unease that seeped into every room. The laughter that had once filled the hallways was now replaced with an almost unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional tense word from the woman or the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the house. The nanny found herself more and more drawn to the woman's office. She knew it was dangerous, that snooping around could get her into trouble, but she couldn't stop herself. Each time she returned to the office, the feeling of uncovering something important, something that could explain everything, pushed her forward. And then, just when she thought she had learned all there was to know, something else would surface. Another piece of the puzzle. Another trail that led her deeper into a web she wasn't sure she could escape. One evening, as the children were in bed, the nanny couldn't resist the pull of the office any longer. She crept down the hall, the house eerily quiet in the dark, save for the faint sound of the wind rustling outside. She entered the office, her heartbeat loud in her ears, and immediately her eyes fell on the desk, where the leather-bound notebook still lay. But this time, there was something different. A second envelope, resting just beside it, caught her attention. This wasn't like the last one. This one was pristine, not crumpled, and it had a name written on the front, her name. Her heart skipped a beat. She picked it up carefully, almost afraid to open it, as if by doing so, she might awaken something even darker than she had imagined. But she had to know. She tore the envelope open with shaking hands, unfolding the note inside. The words were simple, but their impact was immediate. "You've gotten too close. It's time to leave." A chill ran through her. Her fingers trembled as she held the note, the weight of its warning pressing down on her chest. Who had written it? Who was this they that the woman was so afraid of? And why did they want her gone? The air in the room felt suffocating, and every instinct in her body screamed that something terrible was about to happen. She couldn't stay here any longer, not with these messages, not with the feeling that she was being watched, that everything she had been doing was leading her to something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. But as she turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder. She froze, her blood turning cold. The woman's voice followed shortly after, sharp and demanding. "What are you doing in here?" Her heart slammed in her chest as she whirled around to face the doorway. There, standing in the doorway, was the woman, her eyes flashing with something dark and unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. The nanny's mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, trying to think of a way to explain her presence. But the woman didn't give her a chance. "You need to leave," she said, her voice low, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "Now." The words hit the nanny like a slap to the face. For the first time in a long while, she felt true fear. The woman's posture was rigid, her face pale, and there was something in her eyes of desperation, maybe something that hinted at an even darker truth lurking just beneath the surface. The nanny opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but the woman cut her off, her voice sharp and almost frantic. "You don't understand. You don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't just about you. It's about everything." "What are you talking about?" the nanny whispered, her voice shaking. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening. The woman stepped forward, her eyes darting nervously toward the door, as if afraid someone might overhear. She closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. "You've seen too much," she said, her voice almost trembling. "I can't protect you anymore. They'll come for you too, just like they came for me." "What do you mean, they'll come for me?" "Who?" The words tumbled out, a mix of confusion and anger. She had no idea what the woman was talking about, but she could sense the gravity of it, the fear behind every word. The woman swallowed hard, then glanced around the room, as if expecting someone to jump out at them from the shadows. They have eyes everywhere. They watch everything. And once they're aware of you, there's no going back. I should have never involved you. The nanny felt a sharp pang of betrayal. Involved me in what? What have you done? But the woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she paced across the room, her hands wringing in agitation. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. Now it's too late. You don't know what they'll do if they find out what you've seen. The tension in the room was suffocating. The nanny felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, every part of her wanting to run, but her feet were glued to the floor. What had she stumbled upon? What was this web of lies and fear that the woman was wrapped up in? And why had it all come to this? The woman stopped pacing, suddenly still. She turned to the nanny, her face pale, her eyes wild with fear. I can't let you stay here anymore, she said. I have no choice. They'll be here soon. They'll be looking for you. Before the nanny could process what was happening, the woman moved toward her, grabbing her arm roughly. You have to go. Now. The force of the woman's grip shocked the nanny, and for a moment, she was paralyzed. What was happening? Why was she being dragged into this? But the woman's panic was contagious, and a wave of dread washed over the nanny as she realized the woman wasn't just trying to get rid of her, she was trying to protect her from something far worse. The nanny wrenched herself free, her mind racing. I can't leave. Not like this. Not without knowing the truth. The woman's eyes widened, and for a split second, the cold mask of control slipped. She was terrified, raw, vulnerable. You don't understand, she whispered. It's already too late. The woman's words lingered in the air like a warning, but the nanny couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As she stood there, facing a woman she had trusted, she could feel her pulse quicken, her breath shallow. There was a growing sense of urgency, something deep and dark that seemed to pulse through the room. She needed answers, not vague threats. She needed to understand why everything had gone so wrong. Before she could speak, the woman stepped closer, her expression now filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "You need to listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "There are things, people, involved that you won't be able to fight. They'll find you. And once they do, they won't let you go." The nanny felt a chill run down her spine, but a stubborn defiance stirred inside her. She had to know. She couldn't keep living in the dark. "Who are they? What's going on?" The woman's gaze flickered to the corner of the room, and for the briefest of moments, the nanny thought she saw something shift in her eyes, something almost resigned. As if she knew this conversation would come, but she didn't want to face it. Then, just as the woman opened her mouth to speak, the front door slammed open with such force that the entire house seemed to shake. The nanny whipped around, her heart skipping a beat. The woman's face turned ashen, and for a split second, she looked utterly defeated. It was as if everything she had tried to protect had come crashing down in that single moment. Footsteps echoed through the hallway, deliberate and slow, like someone taking their time. The nanny froze, dread spreading through her body. She had never heard those footsteps before. They were heavy, purposeful, and unmistakably different from the usual sounds of the woman's movements. "Who is that?" the nanny whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she moved to the door, placing herself between the nanny and the hallway, blocking her view. "You don't want to see this," she whispered urgently. "You need to leave. Now." But the nanny couldn't move. Something in her gut told her that this was at the moment that everything changed, that the secrets would come to light. She had to see who was coming. She had to know who these people were, and why they had been watching her. She took a step toward the door, but the woman grabbed her arm, holding her back with surprising strength. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer now. And then, just as the nanny tried to pull free, the door swung open, revealing a figure in the doorway, someone she had never seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a hood, but his presence was commanding. The room felt instantly colder, as though the air itself had thickened. The woman stiffened, her face paling even more. She didn't move, but the way her shoulders hunched, the way her eyes darted nervously, told the nanny everything she needed to know. Whoever this man was, he wasn't someone the woman wanted her to meet. He wasn't someone she wanted anyone to see. The man's voice was low, gravelly. "It's time," he said, his words cutting through the silence. His eyes flickered over to the woman before landing on the nanny. "You didn't listen to her, did you?" The woman's grip on the nanny's arm tightened, her eyes pleading. "Please, just go," she begged, her voice breaking. "There's no time. They'll know you've seen him. They'll come for you." But it was too late. The man stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the nanny now, as if he could see right through her. "I warned you. You've gotten too close." The nanny's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body refused to move. This man, this stranger, was standing in the very threshold of the house, and there was nowhere to go. Her mind raced, trying to process everything she had learned in the past few days, but it all felt like too much. There was so much she still didn't understand. The woman, her face crumpling with a mix of fear and guilt, finally spoke again, her voice trembling. "I never wanted this for you. I never wanted anyone else to get involved." She turned to the man, her voice almost pleading. "You can't do this. Please. She doesn't know anything." The man's lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile, but his eyes remained cold. "It's already done. She's seen too much. You know the rules." The words hit the nanny like a punch to the gut. What rules? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her throat tight with terror. What is happening here? The woman's eyes filled with unshed tears as she turned to face the nanny. You have to go. Now. Don't ask any more questions. Just leave, and you'll be safe. Please. But before the nanny could move, the man stepped forward again, this time blocking her path. There's no leaving. Not now. You've made your choice. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Now you'll have to live with it. The tension in the room was unbearable. The nanny could feel her chest tightening, her breath shallow, as the weight of the situation settled over her. The world she thought she knew was unraveling at a pace too fast for her to follow, and the danger was closing in, like a vice. She had stumbled into something dark, something far more sinister than she could have imagined, and now she was trapped in it, unable to escape. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, metallic, and shiny. A key. He held it up for the nanny to see, a wicked smile spreading across his face. You're not getting out of this that easily. The woman's eyes widened in horror. No, she whispered. You can't. But the man was already moving, his gaze locked onto the nanny. I'm afraid it's too late for that. You're part of this now. And once you're in, there's no going back. The nanny's heart raced in her chest as the man stepped closer. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, her entire body screaming to run. But she was rooted in place, too terrified to move, too confused to understand what was happening. The room felt smaller, darker, the air thicker with each passing second. And as the man raised his hand, holding the key in front of her, she knew that whatever came next would change everything. The key glinted under the dim light as the man slowly extended it toward the nanny, his eyes locking onto hers with a sense of finality. She could feel her body stiffening, every instinct screaming at her to move, to fight, but the weight of the situation was too much. She had no idea what this key was for, or what it meant, but it felt like the last thread of control was slipping from her grasp. Take it, the man said, his voice low and almost coaxing. Take the key, and you'll understand. You'll know everything. The woman beside her was shaking, her face pale and contorted in a mixture of fear and regret. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. You have to trust me. Leave now. You still have a chance. But the nanny couldn't tear her eyes away from the key. Something inside her urged her to take it, to find out what lay behind the door the man was trying to open. Was this the final piece of the puzzle? The answer she had been searching for, or the trap that would seal her fate? In that moment of paralyzing indecision, a faint sound interrupted the tension. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping noise. It was coming from the hallway, distant but unmistakable. For a split second, the man's face flickered with uncertainty. His eyes darted toward the hallway, then back to the nanny, as if a new threat had appeared out of nowhere. The woman beside her stiffened, her breathing shallow. Get her out of here, the man hissed, his tone suddenly harsh. Now. The woman, as if waking from a trance, grabbed the nanny's arm and pulled her away from the doorway. The key, still glinting in the man's hand, was left dangling in the air between them for a moment. But before the nanny could make any move toward it, the sound in the hallway grew louder. Footsteps, swift and purposeful, were approaching fast. Without warning, the woman pushed the nanny toward the back of the room. Go! Now! She screamed. The nanny hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of questions. What was happening? Why had the man become so urgent? And why was the woman suddenly so terrified of whatever was coming? Go! The woman shouted again, her voice trembling with raw fear. The nanny, too afraid to ask any more questions, did as she was told. She ran toward the back exit, the sound of the approaching footsteps growing louder with each second. But just as she reached the door, a shrill voice echoed from the hallway. "Stop right there!" The nanny froze, her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, dread coursing through her veins as she saw the figure that appeared in the doorway. It wasn't the man. It was another woman, tall, striking, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. She was dressed in black, her posture rigid and confident, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The woman in black didn't need to say another word. The sheer authority in her presence was enough. She stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving the nanny. The man, who had been holding the key moments earlier, now seemed to shrink in her presence, his expression one of clear fear. "Move," the woman in black ordered, her voice icy. The woman beside the nanny looked at the newcomer, her face paling even further. I didn't think she'd." "You've failed," the woman in black interrupted sharply. "And now you've exposed her." The words sent a shiver down the nanny's spine. She had no idea who this new woman was or what her role was in all of this, but the tension in the room was suffocating. The stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. "You should have kept her in the dark," the woman in black continued, her voice like a cold blade. "But now that she knows, there's no going back." The man glanced nervously at the nanny, then back at the woman in black, as if weighing his options. "You don't understand. She doesn't know anything yet." The woman in black's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight, knowing smile. "She knows everything she needs to know. You've underestimated her." She turned toward the nanny, her gaze never wavering. "And now it's too late for you." The nanny felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She needed answers desperately. But all she had were more questions, and no one seemed willing to tell her the truth. The woman in black took a step closer, her presence overwhelming. "You've been playing a dangerous game, one that's far bigger than you realize. You've become part of something far more complicated than you could have ever imagined. You've opened the door to a world that's been hidden from you, and now there's no way back." The man shifted uncomfortably, as though this new revelation had caught him off guard. "We never meant for her to." "Enough," the woman in black snapped. "You've already failed your task. It's too late for you." But as for her, she turned back to the nanny, her expression hardening. "You can still walk away. Forget everything. Leave now, and you'll be spared." The words hung in the air, hanging like an ultimatum. The nanny stood frozen, torn between the dangerous unknown and the haunting promise of safety. She had already come this far, though. There was no turning back now. "What are you offering me?" she asked, her voice barely audible, but filled with determination. The woman in black smiled cold and calculating. "I'm offering you your life. All you need to do is forget. Walk away, and you'll never hear from us again." For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the decision crushing the nanny's chest. The truth was right there, within her reach, but so were the dangers that came with it. The very thing she had feared, the thing she had been trying to escape, was now an undeniable reality. But just as she thought she had no choice but to run, to forget, a sound broke through the tense silence. The unmistakable sound of a door opening slowly, deliberately. The nanny turned just in time to see another figure standing in the doorway, this one completely unexpected. It was the woman who had first hired her, the one who seemed to have no role in any of this. She stepped into the room with a calm, composed air, her eyes glinting with something dangerously knowing. "You thought you could control this," she said to the woman in black. "But you've underestimated me." The room fell deathly silent. Every eye was on the new figure as she moved toward the nanny, her expression serene but filled with a quiet, unsettling power. "It's over," she whispered. "You don't have to choose anymore. The truth will set you free." The woman in black took a step back, visibly rattled. The tension in the room reached a boiling point, and the nanny felt herself being drawn into a final confrontation between two forces she could hardly comprehend. And as everything seemed to come crashing down in a final storm of revelation and betrayal, the room seemed to grow darker. Something ominous was at play, and the nanny was caught in the center, unsure of who to trust or what to believe anymore. The lines between truth and deception blurred, and the only thing she could be certain of was that her life would never be the same again. The silence that filled the room was suffocating, the air thick with tension. The nanny could feel her heart racing in her chest as she turned from one person to the next, each one a part of the puzzle she was struggling to solve. Her mind was a whirlwind, each question piling on top of the last, desperate for answers that no one seemed willing to give. The woman in black took a step back, her eyes narrowing as the new figure approached the nanny. The woman who had first hired her, the one who had seemed so detached from everything, now stood at the center of the room with an almost regal confidence. There was a quiet power in her presence that was impossible to ignore, and the woman in black seemed to recognize it too, her defiance starting to wane. The nanny's confusion deepened. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady. She didn't know how much longer she could take this. Everything she thought she knew about the situation, about the woman she had worked for, had just been turned upside down. What had she walked into? And why were all these people involved? It was too much for her to grasp. The woman who had hired her, the one who had seemed so ordinary, now gave the nanny a soft, almost apologetic look. "I know this is all overwhelming," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it's time for you to know the truth. Everything that's happened, everything that's been unfolding around you, has been part of something much bigger than you realize." The woman in black, her face now a mask of cold fury, stepped forward again, her eyes locked onto the new figure. "You think you can control this, don't you?" she sneered. "You've been playing games, trying to manipulate everything. But it's over now." The woman who had hired the nanny shook her head. "No," she said softly, her voice calm but resolute. "It's not over. It's only just beginning." She turned to the nanny, her gaze softening. "I'm sorry for everything that's happened to you. But you've been a part of something for much longer than you think." The words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and unyielding. The nanny could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, her mind spinning in confusion. She had never asked for any of this. She had just been trying to do her job, to take care of a family that had seemed, at first, so normal. But now she understood, there was nothing normal about any of this. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you involve me in this?" The woman who had hired her took a deep breath, her expression softening with regret. "You were never supposed to be involved," she said quietly. "You were just meant to do your job, take care of the children. But things got out of hand. We didn't expect you to find out. We didn't expect you to get so close." The woman in black let out a bitter laugh. "You think she's going to believe that? That you didn't have a plan for her from the start?" Her tone was filled with disdain, but there was also a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The woman who had hired the nanny didn't flinch. "I didn't plan any of this," she said firmly. "But it's true that I'm a part of something much bigger. Something that's been in motion for years. And now, it's time for you to decide what you're going to do with the truth." The nanny's mind raced. This was not the answer she had expected. She had wanted clarity, but instead, she was faced with more questions. What was this larger game they were all part of? And why had they chosen her to be a part of it? What had she stumbled into? "You still don't understand," the woman in black said, her voice dripping with scorn. This whole thing was never about you. It was about power. Control. You were just a pawn in a much larger game. And now, you've made a choice that you can never take back. The nanny turned to her, her voice shaking but steady. What are you talking about? What is this? Game? The woman in black smirked. You've been a part of something that's been hidden in plain sight. You thought you were just a nanny, but you were always a piece of a much larger puzzle. And now you've uncovered the truth. The question is, what are you going to do with it? The woman who had hired her stepped forward, her expression soft but filled with urgency. You don't have to make that decision right now. You don't have to choose. I'll protect you, I'll make sure you're safe. But you need to know this is bigger than both of us. The nanny could feel the weight of those words pressing down on her. The situation was spiraling out of control, and there was no way out. Her heart raced, her thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. She had no idea who to trust, who was telling the truth, and who was just trying to manipulate her. But in the end, it didn't matter. The truth, whatever it was, had already changed everything. She couldn't go back to the way things were. The life she had known, the job she had taken, was now a distant memory. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As she stood there, caught between two powerful figures, the room seemed to shrink around her. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of isolation. The woman in black had made her position clear. She was a part of this, whether she liked it or not. And the woman who had hired her, despite her reassurances, wasn't entirely clear on what her true intentions were. But one thing was certain, the nanny couldn't trust anyone completely, not anymore. The truth was too complex, too tangled, and too dangerous. And then, as the tension reached its peak, a new sound broke the silence. A soft, almost inaudible buzz. It was coming from the woman who had hired her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, a phone, but unlike any the nanny had ever seen. The woman glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. "I'm sorry," the woman said quietly, her voice filled with regret. "But it's too late. We can't protect you anymore." The nanny's blood ran cold as she watched the woman turn toward the door. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the nanny one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and something else, something darker. "The truth isn't always what we want it to be," she said softly. "But you've made your choice." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving the nanny standing in the middle of the chaos, with only one certainty: the world she had known was gone. Whatever came next, she would face it alone.